Alright guys, Bill, I'm here back with a new video. In this video, I'm back with another Big Brother ranking here, being one that I've been planning on doing for quite a while here. This is one that I did talk about doing all the way back when I did my ranking of every Big Brother player, but here we'll be ranking every player of Celebrity Big Brother US, to where we obviously have 3 seasons of players at this point to comb through. And here we'll be ranking each player from these seasons based on how I feel like there are players in the grand scheme of things, how I feel like they would do on most given seasons. So again, in general, my criteria is very similar to that of my general Big Brother US list, though obviously taking into account the differences that are there between BBUS and Celebrity Big Brother, the fact that Celebrity Big Brother has a non-sequestered jury, and through that I do think there are a few people that are actually benefited on this list through that fact, as we'll later talk about, though we do have 34 players to be ranking from this list, though in reality we actually only have 33, as first up we're just going to be talking about this person separately from the list, I guess, and that person is Anthony Scaramucci, who, again, I guess wasn't a real player. Now, even if he was, he would not be particularly highly ranked, to where I think he would barely scrape off the bottom, if not still potentially be at the bottom. Again, he was someone that was targeted right away, was the target for week 1. Again, Scaramucci was on his way out anyway, until obviously he got saved by the fact that he wasn't a real player, to where, again, I think the pro for Scaramucci is the fact that he did have allies. He had a good relationship with Kato and Tom, to where, again, at least that's something. Again, I think it would have kept him away from the very, very bottom, though realistically, again, I don't think Scaramucci would have been a good player anyway, but considering he wasn't a real player, I decided just not put him on the proper list. But with that, we now get to the actual 33 players that did actually play the game. Starting it off at number 33, the worst player in Celebrity Big Brother is actually not a first boot. But again, you would expect that the worst player of all time to be someone that was the first boot. This person isn't. And that person is Chris Katan, to where, I mean, this was obviously a debate here. I mean, obviously Chris Katan does survive a couple votes. That's something. Only to then proceed to quit the game. In a spot where, again, if he did not quit the game, who knows how far he would have gone. The issue for me, though, is that Chris Katan just kind of sucks at everything about the game and didn't want to be there and had no prospects in the game. That's kind of why he was being dragged through the game. And while he was an affable presence, again, people didn't mind him, he also didn't really talk to most people. He kind of spent most of his time just sleeping, as really, I mean, the Big Brother environment was simply just not for him. I don't think he really has much potential in any given season, to where, while, again, I think he could definitely stay away from conflict in a way that might make you argue that he should be higher on this list. And to be fair, on a celebrity season, if he had somehow gotten to the end, it's not out of the realm of possibility. I think that they would actually reward him with the win because they are at least burned by him, but it's not like Chris Katan's doing any of this actively. Again, I don't think he's a particularly good player. I don't think he has any potential in any given season. That's why he's here number 33. Now number 32, essentially that, but a step higher, and someone that, again, at least stayed for longer, I guess, and that person is Meta World Peace, to where, again, another quitter of the game. But again, I think Meta is a player that, if he cared, he would have had skills for the game. He had good relationships. People liked him. He, again, is a former basketball player, to where you would think he would do well in competitions. He also had a number of allies at multiple points in the game. Again, at first he was close to the likes of Amarosa and Kesha. He was also close to other men in the house, where, again, he had connections. He's not inherently the worst player ever. The problem is that he just simply doesn't care to play the game. And obviously quits the game in a spot where he probably had a decent amount of longevity on that season if he did not quit. But the problem is that he's probably just going to quit every time he plays because he doesn't care about playing the game. So while I think you could definitely argue the upcoming players that we'll be talking about made bigger mistakes in the game than someone like Meta. I mean, Meta was also someone that literally accidentally voted out Chris Liddell. So, I mean, that's something. But even beyond that, again, I think he's someone that just simply does not really seem to have much potential in the game. The while is the affable presence. And again, if he did not quit, he definitely could have just snuck his way to the end. Again, potentially one due to wonkiness that are celebrity juries. I just do not feel like Meta would have done any of that intentionally. So again, that's why he's here number 32. Now number 31. I think this is the first player that is like a genuine player of Big Brother. Someone that actually tried to play the game and failed. Someone that, again, did not play a great game by the end, but at least tried. And that person is Marissa Tate, who is a player that I think has a level of potential. I mean, she is someone that I remember coming into the season, she was pretty high on most people's boards. I did feel like there was a lot of potential for Marissa, and she really just doesn't demonstrate any of that. So despite the fact that she did a lot of research into the show, she simply just doesn't blend in with the house, is someone that isn't really trusted, and again, while she survives the first round of the game, she's just then an easy boot in week 2, to where, again, it ends up being a very underwhelming run for Marissa. A spot where, again, she has no allies in the game. She has no real prospects in the game. So again, I think if you just look at her game on paper, it's really, really bad. The only reason I wanted to potentially put her higher is because I do think there is potential there again, and she does seem to know the game decently well. But again, based on how we saw her actually properly play the game, it really just did not work. They're just being the social pariah for her entire run and not really being able to do anything through her entire run. So because that, for me, again, she lands her number 31. Now, number 30, a person that Mariah actually outlasted, but someone that, again, like had more going for her in the game. That person is Teddy Mellencamp. And again, at the end of the day, Teddy doesn't play a particularly great game either. But, I mean, again, despite the fact that she is the first boot of the season, I do think she, again, had a good amount of allies. She was pretty close to the likes of like a Carson and a Cynthia, or they were blindsided the fact that she was going home. And I do think she gets very unfortunate the fact that Misha is the first HOH, someone that, again, they did not really click. And again, Teddy, to fair, has some pretty poor social play with her. But still, I do think it is like partially her being unlucky at who specifically is the HOH, as I don't think many other people would have targeted her in this spot, to where even beyond that, again, she almost actually gets out of being taken out this week, to where it ends up being a pretty last second decision to actually decide to backdoor her, to where, again, I think there are pros and cons for Teddy. I think she had allies. She almost escaped this week. She also has some things not playing in her favor. But again, I think she also mishandles her relationship with Misha, and it's obviously the first boot of the season, to where it's not to really justify putting her too much higher. Yeah, at the end of the day, I did land her number 30. Now, number 29, and we're moving on to a person that I essentially look at as like a slightly better version of Teddy by the end of it, and that person is Kesha Knight Pulliam, who has a very strange run on this season. I mean, she is the first HOH of Celebrity Big Brother 1, but is the first HOH due to her essentially just being handed it, where obviously it was Shannon's initially, but still ends up playing her HOH pretty terribly, where, again, she's essentially this, like, I mean, maybe like Willie Hant style figure of her, again, being in this initial majority, them having the entire round set of them targeting James, though at the last second, people were annoyed at how her and Amarosa are domineering the game and end up switching the vote onto Chuck as a shot against her, to where, again, that is bad. But again, I think at the end of the day, the fact that she at least had allies initially is definitely a pro there. It seemed to be getting her way for most of that first week is a pro. Though with that, I think week 2 comes some pros and cons, where pretty much it comes from the typical pros and cons of quitting the game, where, and it's, where again, I think there's positives in the sense that, okay, that means you weren't going to be naturally voted out of the game, where it does seem like Amarosa would have been a target had it not been for her quitting. Though there's also the fact that she did want to quit the game, and through that, again, would she quit the game in most situations? So I don't think she really had the desire to really play the game, especially at the point that she was on the bottom. To where, and I think there's a lot of mixed signals here. To be honest, I could see a debate for her being higher on this list, simply because, again, she did have an initial majority, and it was initially going to get her way. The fact that, again, the vote flips against her, and she eventually gives up in week 2, I think is, again, like, kind of bad, to where at the end of the day, I did land her here, number 29. Now, number 28, we're moving on to a player that, and was at least trying, I think got very unlucky in the way their game plays out, and that person is Chuck Liddell, to where, obviously, Chuck Liddell is the first boot of Celebrity Big Brother 1, but I actually don't think he's that bad of one. I think he's one where, to be honest, he kind of reminds me of someone like Cheryl from Big Brother 2, in the fact that he kind of gets screwed over due to the actions of the HOH more than actions that he does himself, where it feels like it's a move there that's simply just made because they want to take a shot at Amarosa and Kesha more so than anything Chuck actually does wrong. Now, obviously, he is an initial minority that gets him on the block to begin with, along with the fact that, again, people knew about how close him and James were in the outside world, which, again, made them easy targets right away. But I do think, again, he gets unlucky in the fact that he becomes a target when James was going home for a lot of that week, only for it to flip at the last second. In a spot where, again, it's not even like he was really that close to Kesha or Amarosa, where, again, it was simply just a really unlucky position for him to be in. The fact that he was this other option to be taken out, to where it kind of feels like a move that was made simply just to make a move in that spot, and one that was like kind of unnecessary to make, which obviously still faults him for them making that unnecessary move against him. But I still think it also leads to, again, him being a bit unlucky in how all that plays out, to where I think Chuck is actually, again, a player that could have had some potential here. I think a player that seemed to be decent socially, didn't really do that much actively wrong to get himself taken out of the game, but at the end of the day is still first boot of the season, to where, again, kind of tough to put him much higher here than the number 28. And 27, moving on to a player that is on a similar level, but I think makes it much deeper into the game, and that player is Joey Lawrence, where Joey Lawrence is a player that came into Celebrity Big Brother 2 not really knowing what he was doing. I feel like he's probably the player that was the most unaware of the game and was just kind of aloof throughout the early portions of the game. While he was close to the likes of Jonathan and Ryan, I think he was kind of just there for a lot of the early portions of the game, while he proceeds to lose his allies in Jonathan and Ryan, mind you, due to some unlucky circumstances there. But again, he gets to week 3 where, while he seemed like this pretty easy consensus vote, with him being the last member of his original group, he actually almost flips the votes to stay, which is actually like somewhat impressive. The fact that he almost ends up getting Candy blindsided, where the only reason Candy stays is because of her pregame relationship with Tamar, to where, again, I think it's impressive that he almost pulls over that maneuver, but really the rest of his game is not particularly great. It's, again, him just kind of being aloof at the game, kind of just being on the bottom, not really knowing what he's doing. So I think there's that big dichotomy there, where really, I think if he doesn't pull off that almost flip at the end, he probably would have been a few spots lower. Yeah, I think the fact that he finally showed some agency in his final moments of the game, and again, almost pulled off a decent move, again, is enough to put him here, number 27. Now, number 26, someone that I did debate with Joey Lawrence. I think this is a person that, obviously, Joey makes it further than, though, is someone that I think also gets very unlucky in how their game plays out. I think, again, seemed to be a player that had more potential long-term had things gone the right way, and that player is Ryan Lochte. And yeah, it's kind of funny that Ryan Lochte isn't an entirely bad Big Brother player, where I remember coming into this season that everyone just thought he was a joke, that he would be someone that would be so aloof in the game. Yet he actually was playing kind of decently at the beginning. I mean, he is the first HOH, and obviously he ends up losing his closest ally through that first HOH, but he's very unlucky to lose his first ally through that HOH. So where obviously that's a position where he was obviously screwed by a twist in a spot where I don't think he does that much actively wrong, even though, again, on paper he does. Obviously the likes of Lola and Natalie had an alliance with him and Jonathan and ended up flipping on it, which is the reason why that foot flip ends up happening, though. And all the mechanics leading up to that vote are just inherently so unlucky. The fact that Jonathan was forced on the block, the fact that Scaramucci was not a real player, which allowed for the veto to be used on Tom. And again, all these like wonky circumstances happen there. Where again, when mixing out the fact that I don't think him and Jonathan do that much actively wrong, we get the votes flipped on them. Again, I don't think Ryan is that bad of a player there. And then we get to week 2, where again, he's essentially a dead man walking, considering everyone is in on the backdoor plan, which again, obviously shows a lack of threat management, but it's also him, again, essentially having no real shot in the game, to where while people found him very affable in the game, people liked him. Again, they simply thought he was too threatening in the game, which again, I think is definitely a flaw, and is a flaw that is shared with some of the people we're about to be talking about. But again, I did feel like he was a largely affable presence, and him also being in the initial majority, to where despite his lack of threat management, I feel like he's good enough to be here at number 26. Now, number 25, who would have guessed it? We're rounding up this trio all in a row. At 25, we have Jonathan Bennett, the first boot of Celebrity Big Brother 2, but also one that is actually a pretty good first boot. I mean, for someone that was the first boot, he was very much screwed over in the game. I mean, he is someone that was not supposed to be the first boot. I mean, had that been a normal HOH, there's no way Jonathan goes home there. Obviously, he had a very strong relationship with Ryan. They were ride or dies, and essentially gets screwed over by a twist that essentially forced him on the block because he lost a competition, which is even dumber that he was only in position to lose that competition because he won the first competition. So essentially, it's him being punished for actually performing well in challenges. So again, that's really dumb. But then again, as I mentioned with Ryan, again, he gets so unlucky in many aspects of this first week. Again, the fact that Scaramucci was not a real player, which stopped the initial eviction, which would have just been a very easy Anthony vote. But even then, after that, when it was Tom Green on the block, Tom Green would have been a very likely boot until he gets vetoed off by Kato, which allows Kato and Tom to get enough leverage in the game to flip over Natalie and Lola, leading to Jonathan getting sniped out of the game. In a spot where, again, I don't think Jonathan does that much wrong to put this bullseye on his back. For a while, I do think, obviously, him and Ryan came off as these very strong players, and obviously, yeah, they could have managed Lola and Natalie better. I do feel like at the end of the day, I don't fault him too much for all that occurred there, and I do think at the end of the day, he just gets very unlucky in the way that this entire situation plays out. So where, while there obviously is still poor play in him not being able to manage Lola and Natalie and keep them on his side, I do still think probably ends up being the most unlucky player in all of Celebrity Big Brother, probably the most screwed over player in all of Celebrity Big Brother. So he goes from being an initial majority and in a spot where they could have potentially run the game into him being just the first boo of the season due to a lot of unlucky circumstances. So we're mixing out of the fact that, again, I think there's a lot of potential in him as a player, and the fact that he is a massive fan of the game and seemed to know what he was supposed to be doing in the game. Again, at the end of the day, I do think he is easily the best first boot of Celebrity Big Brother, which puts him here at number 25. 5. Now number 24, we're moving on to a player that was very difficult to assess because I think there's a massive difference between this person's potential and this person's actual game that they played. But here the player in the spot is Shannon Elizabeth. And Shannon Elizabeth is a player I obviously want to put a lot higher. And she's a player that obviously was a massive fan of the show and someone that obviously was very good at competitions. And in general, again, there's a lot to like on paper. I think Shannon Elizabeth, again, is a player that just coming into that season, I very much expected her to be a massive player on the board. The problem is that she really ends up mishandling a lot of it. And she ends up winning competition after competition where it puts a massive target on her back. So people were talking about her within the house as one of the best players of Big Brother of all time, which was insane. But again, it really just shows a massive lack of threat management in that spot. And beyond that, I think she also ends up just being outplayed by the likes of Ross and Marissa and has the wool pull over her eyes as well. And that's not great. Though, again, I will say she pulls off this blind side and taking out Chuck and organizes the votes there. Again, that is impressive. Also, by the time she leaves, she actually does have allies. Again, both Mark and James did want to keep her around. Though, again, I think there are pros to be had there. For mixing that and the fact that, again, I do think there is a good player in her. It made me want to put her relatively high on this list. Yeah, I do feel like this is around the spot that I had to leave her off. I feel like the fact that she was just such a massive target on the board, it's kind of hard to justify putting her much, much higher, but I do have her here number 24. Now number 23, we're moving on to a player that I really did not know what to really do with this person. I feel like it's a person that I don't really have a great grasp on how they are as a player in the grand scheme of things, but again, they won competitions, they were in and out of the majority at points. At 23, I do have Kalin. And again, Kato is someone that, again, won comps at points in the game. That allowed him to gain control in the game. That had him, again, winning the veto and saving Tom in a spot where Tom, his closest ally, would have gone home. Again, that's decent. He won HOH in a spot where he led a successful backdoor on Ryan. That's also pretty good. The problem is that I don't think he was ever really that well integrated in the game. And again, he was initially on the bottom alongside Tom and Scaramucci, to where while obviously he was not put in the block, but again, good on him for that, he still was someone that was a potential backup at that point in the game. He also obviously just makes himself too big of a target through his comp wins, where again, he wins a veto and HOH back to back. And then with Tom essentially doing the same thing, it just makes them such a big power duo in the game that where, again, they were easy targets, to where obviously he gets taken out over Tom, to where again, you can definitely fault him threat management wise for that. I do still feel like at the end of the day, it does leave me in the spot of Kato, to where again, I think there's a lot of mixed signals here. I do think, again, I think he does some decent social work at points. Again, he is able to build a bond with Tom. He then proceeds to build an alliance with Lola and Natalie. That ends up running the game for a couple rounds, even though again, they were always going to flip on him. But again, that is something. And the fact that he also wins these comps, and again, does decent moves with them. Again, credit to him for that. But at the end of the day, again, I still think a very questionable player, someone that didn't have much long-term potential in the game, and that's why he's here number 23. Now number 22, and this is another player I find very difficult to assess. I think there's definitely arguments that this person should be higher. I think there's some arguments this person should be lower. However, at 22, I'm going to go with Kato's partner in crime. I'm going with Tom Green. And again, I love Tom Green on Survivor 2 when it aired. I found Tom Green to be just such a ridiculous character for Big Brother, to where, again, I think that might hold him in higher regard for me than he should, to where, again, I actually thought he would be higher on this list, to where I initially thought he would be somewhere in the 14 to 18 range. However, when really thinking about it, is he even that much better than Kato? I mean, in reality, again, him and Kato are on the block together. Obviously, yeah, they keep him around over Kato. But again, even then, after that, he proceeds to win HOH and veto the following week. Through that, he is obviously safe, but also ends up making some questionable calls and saving Ricky in a spot where Ricky was one of his biggest detractors. He obviously then proceeds to be taken out the very following week. He obviously then proceeds to be taken out the very following round, or while he did do some strong work in building a bond with Candy, again, it's simply just not enough at that point. And really, again, looking at his game beyond that, it's very rocky. I mean, it's one where he obviously is aligned with Anthony Scaramucci, and again, would not have been the first boot of the season if Scaramucci was a real player, but once Scaramucci was a real player, he was going to be booted if Kato didn't win the veto, and again, that's a tough spot to be in. So essentially after that, it's him and Kato winning the comps for next few rounds in a spot where his own alliance flips on him during his HOH reign, to where they want to flip the vote onto Candy despite him, yet obviously don't because of Tamar and her connection to Candy, to where, again, I don't think Tom does much actively well there, and again, after that, him and Kato are targeted to fall ground, to where, again, there's not really a point in the game where he really maintains that much control in the game that isn't based around competition. I mean, he literally goes through the entire game with some level of immunity. Whereas on the block, again, he is nominated week 1, and even then has the veto used on him. He wins the veto week 2, wins the HOH week 3, is nominated week 4, wins HOH and Veto week 5, and is still taken out immediately following that. So where again, I think Tom Green's game is realistically not much better than Kato's. I think they're essentially the same. Now, again, I guess you can give him a little bit more credit for the fact that he wins more comps, but obviously he stayed longer in the game. So where, again, I think at the end of the day, I think it's very tough to assess Tom Green. So I essentially narrowed it down to wherever Kato lands. I think Tom's essentially just a spot above him for just outlasting him. For mixing out the fact that he was just constantly on the outs, I did feel like I had to land him here at number 22, number 21. Now we're getting to a streak of 3 players in a row here that were all pretty late gamers on their respective seasons. Again, all people that made deep runs, potentially could have won the game had they gotten to the end, yet none of them played particularly well. And at number 21, we're starting it off with Lamar Odom, who, again, gets 5th place in a spot where, had he made Final 2, he probably wins. But obviously, none of that was intentional. And really, I feel like he's just kind of maneuvering through the game in a way that he doesn't even know what he's doing. He's kind of just being dragged along by the other players around him, just looking at other people as more direct threats, to where while Lamar does and eventually realize that, okay, I need to take the shot at Misha and Todrick, simply is never really given the opportunity to do so, to where, again, give him credit for sure for recognizing the fact that he should take them out. But again, I just feel like so little of his game is very intentional, to where really for me, it's like the main difference between him and Meta World Peace is the fact that Meta World Peace quits the game and Lamar doesn't. Or we got to see Lamar's game play out while we never got to see Meta World Peace's. So where again, if Meta World Peace didn't quit, he probably would be around this spot on the list too. So where again, Lamar was someone that I think was just really just stumbling his way through the game, even though again, he technically was on the right side of things numbers wise for the entirety of the game. So that's something, but he was always at the bottom of his alliance and didn't really have a path to the very, very end, even though again, he likely wins if he gets there. But again, I just don't think he played particularly actively and didn't have much agency, so that's why he's here number 21. Now number 20, we're moving on to another player that made it very deep into the game in a spot where they potentially could have won the game. And that player is Dena Lohan from Celebrity Big Brother 2, who, again, potentially wins the game had she somehow gotten to the end. Now, again, also had no path to the end, had to win the final comp, which she was very unlikely to do, and was very clueless throughout the majority of the game. Yet, despite that, again, probably wins if she gets to the end. Had a lot of friends on the jury, to where, I think, especially if she gets to the end against someone that isn't Tamar, I think she's likely to win. Though even then, I could see a world where Lola beats her. Or, to be fair, her win's definitely not as secure as someone like Lamar's was. Though, to be fair, I feel like that's more so just based around the game that happened around them more than anything that they specifically actively did. But again, I think Dena at least is a more affable presence. I think she's someone that no one disliked in the house. Where I think by the time Lamar left, again, there were people that were getting kind of annoyed with him. To where I think Dena is a purely affable presence, one that didn't really do much actively in the game, but also again didn't necessarily do much actively wrong, I guess. Where I believe outside of the first vote, she does vote correctly the rest of the way. That's something. But also someone that, again, didn't really have a path to the end because, again, she was never winning that final comp, to where not a great game as a whole, but again, her longevity is enough to put her here at number 20. Now number 19. We're moving on to another player that almost won the game, because this person most definitely wins the game if they get to the end. They were one vote away from getting there, and that person is Cynthia Bailey. Now, the issue with Cynthia Bailey is I don't think Cynthia Bailey really did much in the game. Or again, I think she just kind of followed around whoever was her closest ally at that point, specifically Carson for a lot of it, where again, they made a lot of suboptimal moves together. Well, we then see her latch on to Todrick after that, to where Todrick's just using her as a number. So she's kind of dragged to 3, where she's eventually voted out. Though, again, it's another position where if Cynthia gets to Final 2, she wins the game. If she wins that final HOH, she wins the game. If she is able to convince Misha to take her, which was never happening, she wins the game. Again, she wins the game against both Todrick and Misha, which again, she was essentially a comp win away from getting to that scenario. So that's something. But again, I just feel like she didn't really do much actively right to get in that position, and again, it was kind of being tricked or led along by other players throughout the majority of it, to where, you know, while she came extremely close to winning the game, I don't feel like much of that was due to any particularly strong play from her, which is why she's here at number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to a player that, I'll be honest, I very much consider putting this person lower. I think there's definitely arguments this person should be closer to like the Tom Greens and the Katos of the world. But instead, at number 18, I decided to go with Brandy Glanville, which again was a bit of a debate for me. I do feel like Brandy is a player that was in the initial majority, again, had this good relationship with Ross and was able to, you know, work alongside the other women to initially target the men, though eventually ends up flipping the vote onto Chuck by the end of the week, and then proceeds to still be in the majority as they vote out Kesha and Shannon. So again, I think that 3-week stretch is pretty solid. Again, she is in the majority the entire time. and has a good backing. At that point, again, having a decent amount of allies. The problem is that her game really crumbles the following week, where Amarosa ends up winning HOH, and she's essentially dead man walking had it not been for Meta World Peace quitting the game. Or had he not quit, she more than likely ends up going home in that spot, only to then proceed to be targeted the following week anyway. Mark proceeding to target her, with at that point, again, her having pretty much most of the house against her, to where, again, it's not great, to where, again, I very much debate putting them closer to, like, the Tom Greens and the Katos. Yeah, I decide Brandy should be higher here, specifically because I feel like she maintained power in the game for a bit longer, where, again, I feel like Tom and Kato, again, started off on the bottom and were able to recover from that, but even then, they kind of maintained in that position simply because they were winning comps. And the first opportunity that they lost comps, they were back on the bottom. Brandy is someone that, again, never wins a comp. And through that, her being able to stably be in the majority for the first 3 rounds of the game, again, to me is at least a little bit more impressive. So while her game, again, really goes off the rails by the end, I do feel like the fact that she was in the majority early on, and again, showed a lot of active play within that, is enough to put her here at number 18. Now, number 17, another relatively sloppy player here for very similar reasons of their game going off the rails at the very end, but I think there's good play at the beginning, and that person is Chris Kirkpatrick from Celebrity Big Brother 3, to where, again, I think Chris is a player that initially played pretty well. He is in the majority early on, works alongside the likes of Misha and Todrick and Shayna, and they end up in the charge and taking out Teddy, and then Mariah, though, again, he's eventually taken out in week 3 in a spot where I think there's a lot of rocky play there. But while I think there is impressive play as well, and the fact that he realizes that Misha and Todrick are threats and wants to target them, to where, again, he flips over to Carson and Cynthia and builds a relationship with them. The problem is that Misha wins HOH and targets Carson and Cynthia to the point where it becomes very clear that Chris Kirkpatrick's trying to work with them, to where once the veto is used, he ends up being backdoored, to where, again, all that is really, really bad. So again, I think there's definitely an argument that he should be closer to the likes of Tom and Kato, to where I did actually really consider that at first. However, I think in comparison to them, I think he has a lot more agency in the game. But through that, I think there's also, again, impressive play from the fact that he was able to pivot in the game. And again, I think he had a lot more agency in that, to where unlike the likes of Tom and Kato, who, and I think a lot of their power in the game came through them winning competitions. Again, I think Chris was able to do this through more social strategy means. I feel like he was in a spot where he was actually kind of screwed over by a comp result, where, again, had his side won HOH that week, and essentially would have put him in a pretty power position. Or again, if they had been able to get Misha out that week, it would have really opened up the game to where I think he would have had a lot of potential down the road. Again, now having a new relationship with Carson and Cynthia, having his really close relationship with Shayna, and seeming to have respect, to where I think he probably would have won a jury vote if he got into the end. Where, again, I think he was in a good spot to potentially win if his big gambit worked out. It just didn't, and again, it kind of makes him look worse by the end of it, considering the fact that he gets his own closest ally to use the veto in a spot where he essentially backdoors himself, and again, that's really bad. But again, I think there was some definite upside to that move. Obviously, there was a lot of downside to where, again, it's a very rocky game. So while it might seem high for this list, the fact that an early boot like this is in the top half of players, I did end up going with him here at number 17. Now, number 16, one spot better, we have Shayna Moakler. And Shayna is a player that I think demonstrates so much potential. Again, she is someone that is obviously a fan of the show, someone that was playing the game pretty aggressively, and someone that I really wanted to be a better player. But I think by the end of it, again, she just kind of wasn't. Her game just comes off very sloppy, to where, while I think she definitely demonstrates a lot of the same pros as Chris, the fact that she was, again, in a initial majority alliance with Misha and Todrick, she, again, is willing to flip on that group and is able to reintegrate herself with Carson and Cynthia. The issue is that by the end of that week, despite her, again, using the veto on Carson, saving him, she's not able to maintain that trust, so where Carson proceeds to get tricked into backdooring her the following week in a spot where the entire house is in on backdooring her. And again, that's really, really bad. However, at the end of the day, again, in comparison to Chris Kirkpatrick, she's essentially just a spot above him. She survives over him. She also wins more comps than him and demonstrate ability in that way as well, to where, again, I think she is essentially just the better version of Chris Kirkpatrick, to where, while I do think, again, there maybe is some worry jury prospect-wise in the sense that at least within the house, people were not particularly high on her, where we see, again, like Todrick be able to really demonize her to the rest of the other players. I do feel like, again, at the end of the day, I think she is a very competent player, but one that I just don't feel like she really demonstrated her potential by the end of it. But again, I think the potential that is there is good enough to put her here at number 16. Now, number 15, keeping with Celebrity Big Brother 3. So again, it's funny that we're barely halfway through the list and we're already through most of this cast, but at number 15, we have a player that was just a very sloppy player as a whole, and that player, to where while there definitely is a lot of natural skill for the game, I do feel like there's also a lot of bad in their game, and that person is Carson Kressley. And Carson's an interesting player here, as I think there's a lot there that makes him feel like kind of the perfect Celebrity Big Brother player if he could really execute on a lot of his game, where again, I think there's a lot of impressive aspects to Carson as a Big Brother player. Again, he is able to win comps. He does win some competitions here and there. He is very good socially, and he is adored by most of the people that he meets, to where while again, it kind of comes off too threatening to where it actually makes him a big target early on, he does do very good social work at points. And again, because that, again, I think there is a lot of potential to do well, specifically on Celebrity Big Brother, of all shows. A show that doesn't really care that much about the strategy of the game. The problem is that he's just kind of actively bad strategically. I mean, too much so. So while I do think he does good work in getting Chris and Shayna to flip to him, he also then proceeds to not believe Shayna and target Shayna, which really just leaves him open to be targeted the following round, where, again, that is really bad. In general, again, I would not have much faith in Carson's overall strategic ability. I think he really just goes with whatever the last person that campaigned to him told him, to where, to be fair, I do think obviously there was an outside the game relationship between him and Todrick that influenced that as well, though really as a whole, I do think Carson is just someone I don't have really much faith in strategically, even though I think he's very good at the other aspects of the game. And again, that makes his placement on this list a bit strange, where I do think there's definitely an argument he should be higher on this list. I actually didn't initially have him higher on this list yet. I just think he's complete fallacies strategically, along with him also just, again, being on the bottom from the very beginning. It's kind of tough to put him much higher. I think there is a lot of potential from a game perspective, from a Celebrity Big Brother perspective in particular, but again, not enough to put him much higher here in number 15. Now, number 14, we're moving on to a player that I really did not know what to do with. I feel like this is a player that definitely had some pros, definitely had a lot of cons, and that player is Amarosa. And Amarosa is a player that obviously made it all the way to 5th place. She is someone that, again, on paper at least, comes relatively close to winning the game. Now, again, I don't know if they really wanted to reward Amarosa yet. I do think there was enough vitriol for the top 2 in particular, and it wasn't a jury that really cared that much about the game, to where I could see where if Amarosa got to the end, again, she would have won. Again, it's actually being 2 comps away from that, to where mixing that in with the fact that I do think Amarosa played the game hard, at least. Again, she does initially form this big majority alliance with all the women, though also gets kicked out of that alliance by the end of week 1 and ends up being the target week 2, only to be saved by Kesha quitting the game, and beyond that has a big underdog run. Now, within that, again, there's some pros, there's some cons. Obviously, the con is that she does have the majority alliance targeting her for a lot of it. However, I do think she does good work in building bonds with the people on the bottom. Again, she builds a bond with Mark and with James Maslow that keeps her safe during Mark's HOH at least. And to be fair, the other 2 rounds, she does have the HOH herself. But again, I do think her being able to build that relationship with Mark that keeps her safe for the final 7 round is something that, again, is moderately impressive here. Now, I would qualm with her decision to take out James at the final 6, though really also, I think she was in a tough spot either way. Again, obviously Ross won the veto, who would have by far been her optimal target, and I guess she could have gone for Ariana, though again, I don't think that's actually a better target anyway, to where, again, I think she's kind of strong-armed into getting rid of a potential shield for her, to where, again, if she is able to survive that final 5 round, which she likely does if James is still in the game at that point, if she just wins that final HOH, she probably wins the game. Now, again, I think as a whole, her game is very sloppy. It's one where, again, she's in and out of the majority. She has some very impressive play. She does end up playing a very manipulative game at points, but also does genuinely good social work at points. So again, I think it's a very questionable game here. I think the reason why she's as high is because, again, she comes relatively close to winning the game. I think in comparison to, again, the people that were further back on the list, like and Kato, I feel like she at least survives a round in her underdog run through social strategy means, to where, again, I think it's a very rocky game, but her longevity, plus, again, good social workout points, leaves you here at number 14. Now, number 13, moving on to a player that Amarosa took out of the game. Sticking with season 1, we do have James Maslow. And James is another player, very rocky game, in and out of the majority constantly throughout that season. Though, I think as a whole is just a more well-rounded player where, well, Amarosa, again, did win HOHs for sure. Again, I do think the comps that she won were not the most skill-based, to where I think James is, again, the more typical comp beast you would typically see from Big Brother. A person who seems pretty well-rounded in terms of competitions, to where while he only technically wins 1 veto across the season, again, he does perform very well in most competitions on this season. But beyond that, again, I think there's also good work within that. Again, I think he does good social work in the sense that he is initially the target in week 1, though is able to get the women to flip the vote onto Chuck, despite that not really even benefiting them that much. Through all, you could definitely fault that on Kesha and Amarosa for getting the women to flip on them, I do feel like James does some decent work within that as well. And beyond that, I think he reintegrates himself within the majority pretty well. Again, he builds a strong bond with Ross and Marissa, where he's being kept safe by them. He also builds a strong bond with Shannon, to where, while that ends up leading to him being on the block against her, again, I think that could have paid dividends down the road. He also builds a strong bond with Amarosa, to where, again, that's the reason why he's not targeted until she really is forced to do so. While also, again, maintaining a very strong final two with Mark that really benefits him through the game as well. To where, again, I think James ends up being a pretty competent player all around. To where, while I'm not the most impressed by his strategic acumen in the game, I do feel like, again, he does good social work and is particularly decent at challenges as well. To where, again, he feels like a decent all-around player, which puts him here at number 13. Now, number 12. And at number 12 here, again, I think this was a tough player to assess in the sense that I think this is a player that has a lot of potential. Yeah, I think the game they played in their actual season is not the greatest. So while there was a lot of hype around this player at the time, I do think it was a bit overstated from my point of view, and that person is Candy Burris, who, again, I think definitely demonstrates a lot of ability in the game. I mean, she is affable socially. She seemed to be picking up on the game strategically by the end. The problem is that she couldn't really do anything about it. She never wins a competition on the season, and through that, just kind of ends up being on the bottom for a good chunk of the game, really. Again, I mean, she's nominated week 1, where she was a potential target before the flip vote on Jonathan. She then is the target and is nominated in week 3. And that's a point where the vote almost flips on her, where the only reason it doesn't is because of her relationship with Tamar, which I will say, again, I think that's something also tainting her placement on this list, is that I feel like a lot of the reason why she makes it as deep as she does is because of her relationship with Tamar, which was obviously an outside the game relationship, not based within the game itself, which, again, I guess credit to her for having outside connections that she just so happened to be cast with. But, again, I'm not really going to praise her too much on this ranking for that when it feels like she's being saved by things outside of the game. And really, she just spends most of the game just on the bottom of the main power structure, and she's not in the core alongside like Tamar, Ricky, Lola, Natalie. And while she's definitely involved in taking out Natalie in the final 7, she still ends up being on the bottom alongside Tom until she's taken out unceremoniously at the final 5. Where, again, I think there's potential there with Candy. However, I don't think she ever executes on it. I think she's just constantly on the bottom, being saved by her relationship with Tamar at points, and is never able to live up to that potential that I do see there. To where, again, I think it makes it tough to rank her here. I say go with number 12. I think there's an argument she should be higher, especially just based on natural skill, to where I think if she were to play again, I think there's a lot of potential for playing a pretty impressive game. Yeah, I think based on the game that we saw, it's just a game that is, again, too deeply flawed for me, to where, again, I have her here at number 12. Now, number 11, we're moving on to a player that initially was lower than Candy. However, I think the big difference for me is at least this person was in a dominant alliance throughout their season. So while I think Candy is probably a more skilled player in the grand scheme of things, this person was, again, in the majority for the entire season, and again, at least showed towards the end that he could start winning some competitions, and that person is Todd Bridges. And Todd is a player that, again, I don't know how well he does on most given seasons. I feel like he's the type of player that would just be on the bottom on most given seasons and never really given the time of day. However, on this specific season, he did build a strong bond with Misha and Todrick that keeps him safe throughout the majority of the game. Again, puts him in this majority alliance alongside them, and puts him in a majority alliance that has him in the know of what's going on in the game. To where, mixing that and the fact that he also builds a really strong bond with Lamar, to where it shows, again, him having connections in the game, and also being in a spot where if he gets to final 2, he pretty handily wins against Misha and Todrick, to where, again, there's a lot good there from Todd. The problem is, again, I don't know how repeatable that is. I don't think Todd is the type of player that would be able to do this again. I feel like really him doing it the first time was not necessarily purposeful, but again, I think when just looking at his navigation through the game, it is pretty smooth with him being the majority the entire time. It comes into the final 5, again, having the majority and being primed to take out Misha, but just could not get the right comp results to actually take her out. So I think there's definitely some good from Todd. However, I do think in general he's the type of player that I would not expect to do well in most given seasons, but again, he did well in this one, so it's enough to put him here at number 11. Now number 10, and now we're moving on to a player that is higher on this list than I expected. I mean, I always look at this player as a bit of an understated player in Celebrity Big Brother, someone that, again, almost wins the game, and again, kind of gets minorly screwed out of their win to a degree due to the endgame format of Celebrity Big Brother, and that person is Mark McGrath. And again, Mark is a player that is kind of in and out of the majority for a lot of the season. Again, in comparison to Todd, Todd is more solidly in the majority throughout the entire season. Mark is kind of scrapping on the bottom, but I do think actually playing pretty well from the bottom. I think he is able to build these really strong bonds with the likes of James, Amarosa, that actually keeps him really safe in the game, where there's not really a point where he's actually in danger of going home. So the only time he's nominated in the game is during the Shannon boot week, and even that is a replacement nom where, again, he was just very easily a pawn. Where, again, I think in general his navigation through the game is very solid. He does win at HOH, and I think he makes a very good move with that HOH, and he takes out Brandy, essentially keeping around all the people that he has good connections with. Again, he has, where at that point, again, he's kind of in the middle of like the Amarosa James side of things and the Ross and Marissa side of things, so it really just allows him to continue to play that middle. And then he's in a spot where he actually does gain Ross's loyalty. Again, by the end game, Ross wanted to go to the end against Mark, in a spot where he beats Ross, where, again, the jury he was just very anti-Ross, did not want Ross to win, where anybody against Ross would have won the game. Where while Mark was not the most inherently respected on the jury, again, he does handily beat Ross in a jury vote. And again, it's a position where he's kind of screwed over by the fact that the final HOH happens at final 4, and that person gets to evict 2 people. Where again, it's both unlucky in the fact that it skips over to final 3 round, where again, if it was just a final 4 round, Marissa wins HOH, votes out Ariana, and then he has very good odds of him or Ross winning final HOH to take each other to the end of the game. Beyond that, even in this position, he obviously gets to the end of the game at that point and wins the game, to where he had very good odds of winning the game and gets very unlucky at how these comps played out. So again, I think Mark is a very understated player in Big Brother. The main reason he's not higher is because, again, he was kind of on the bottom for a decent chunk of the season. So while, again, I think he makes the most of being on the bottom, he still, again, is at the bottom. And like at the end of the day, it's not like he was this massive jury threat on the board. Realistically, I think he's probably the smallest jury threat on the board outside of Ross and Marissa, to where, again, it makes him a bit tough to assess. But I do think the fact that, again, I think his navigation through game's pretty solid, and again, he had a lot of win equity against Ross, who was his intended final 2. I think is enough to put him here at number 10. Now number 9, and now we're getting to what I would consider some of the better players of Celebrity Big Brother, to where while these players are still very flawed, I think these players all had relatively deep runs. I mean, maybe this first one being the most withstanding, but were in dominant alliances, were players that had a lot of agency. Maybe take one out, which we'll talk about. But anyway, at number 9, we're going to be starting this all off with Natalie Eva Marie, who, again, is the earliest boot left on the board. Again, she was a final 7 boot, which is relatively early in the game still, where everyone beyond this has made finale night. So again, Natalie definitely stands out in that aspect. But again, Natalie's someone that really ran the early portions of the season, and she was alongside Lola, being these people in the middle that, again, initially sided with Jonathan and Ryan, then later flips against them to take out Jonathan alongside Tom and Kato, and beyond that maintains their position in the middle, really having the power to flip the vote at any instance if they really wanted to, where they also had connections to Ricky, they had connections to Tamar, like they had the numbers for sure. And again, they really just run the show, really using Tom and Kato to take out the other members of their alliance, only to then flip on them at the first instance. Now, Natalie does end up being taken out pretty much following that, where Tom ends up winning an HOH and snipes her out of the game. But again, I think it's in a spot where, again, I think Natalie gets very unlucky in the situation there, where Tom wins HOH and veto and really just optimizes the nominees to where she goes home, to where, well, she probably also goes home against like Tamar. I do think if the initial nom stayed the same of her against Ricky, I think there's a big shot that Ricky ends up going home. Also beyond that, I think Tom and Candy are really the only 2 that would even go for Natalie in that spot. So I think she gets kind of unlucky in that aspect as well. And again, I think she was in a really dominant position for the early portion of the season, to where, while again, she is the earliest boot with the people left on the board, I do feel like she still ran the early portions of the season. And had she not been sniped out of the final 7, I think she would have had a lot of win equity coming to the end. But obviously her being taken out relatively early makes it tough to really assess her too highly. Again, I have to leave her here number 9. Now number 8, and here we're moving on to essentially the same thing, but slightly better, with this person making it further in the game, and that person is Lolo Jones. Obviously, Natalie's ride or die in the game, and again, Lolo, I think, plays a very interesting game, where, again, she's in a dominant alliance the entire time. She's alongside Natalie and Ricky and Tamar as they really run a lot of that season, with her also essentially being at the top of that pecking order, where her and Natalie are the ones that are able to decide how the game's playing out. So again, I think all that is very impressive play. The issue is, I think, obviously, Lola has a bit of temper issues. Again, she gets into fights. She not particularly treat people well, to where, again, leaving the house, people did not particularly like Lolo. Now, I will say, she does have a lot of win equity by the end, to where it did seem like that kind of turned around outside the show, which is kind of what makes it very difficult to assess Celebrity Big Brother players. The fact that there's so many outside of the show circumstances that affect the game, and I do think by the end of it, people felt sympathetic to Lolo. It's where I do think Lolo would have beat Ricky for sure if they got to the end together. And I think she definitely gets votes against Tamar, to where, again, I think her win equity kind of goes up a bit. Considering, again, her intention was to go to the end with Ricky. Again, at least that helps her a bit. Again, she was at least heading for a situation that she was planning on winning. Now, obviously, she fails to maintain Ricky's loyalty, particularly because she doesn't lock in a final 2 with him, which is pretty bad, despite the fact that he asked her for one. To where, again, I think there's a lot of mixed signals here with her game, but again, I think there's also a lot of pros, again, her being able to really run this game for a lot of the season, where while on paper, I would say Natalie is probably the better player than Lolo. Lolo obviously makes it further and had win equity at the very end, a spot where she was so close to getting to the end, where, again, I think at the end of the day, that is enough to put Lolo one spot higher than her at number 8. Now, number 7, and at number 7, we're getting to the first winner of Celebrity Big Brother. Here we do have Marissa Jarrett Winokur, the winner of season 1, who is a pretty bad winner from my point of view. Again, I've always assessed her extremely low. And again, she is this high, obviously one, due to the fact that she's a winner, but also again, she is working alongside Ross for most of the season. They're essentially co-dominating the game, even though I think Ross does a lot more of the active work. But again, she's in a very good position for the majority of the game. I think an issue is the fact that she doesn't even maintain Ross's loyalty by the end. By the end, Ross, again, is willing to cut Marissa and is actively striving to cut Marissa, just that he never gets the opportunity to do so. In a spot where she also gives up her game for Ross. Again, she is so aloof to her actual win prospects to where she thought Ross was going to win the game. She went to the end with him and actively took him to the end, which is so bad. So again, like comparing her to all the winners of North American Big Brother, she is definitely amongst the worst in the history of the show. However, I do think, again, she is a player that is definitely benefited from this being a celebrity Big Brother list. I think Celebrity Big Brother is a show that has more potential to reward someone like Marissa, someone that, again, was not necessarily the main driver of the game, and her getting the votes essentially because she's a mom, and also there being a lot of the pro-women sentiment on the jury, to where mixing out the fact that, again, there's a lot of anti-Ross sentiment, obviously leads to her winning. In a spot where, again, it's not even like the jury really loved Marissa either, where I do think Marissa struggles to win against literally anybody else, but she just so happens to get to this final two that she wins in a spot where she thought that was actually the only final two that she loses, to where, again, I think she has very bad reads on the jury in that spot. And in general, again, I think she's a very mixed player. I think she is very good socially, and she obviously wins comps here and there. She obviously, again, is in a dominant alliance for a majority of it, even though, again, that alliance isn't necessarily getting their way for a lot of it. But again, she's involved in taking out Chuck. She is essentially the decision maker on who goes home in week 2, also being part of the Shannon blindside in week 3, to where, well, again, her game goes off the rails after that, particularly due to some unlucky comp results there. She's still able to stay in the game in a spot where, again, she wins at the end. So mixed bag of a game for sure. I wish I could put her higher. I would if she was obviously playing a lot more intentionally, but she wasn't, and was actually striving for what she thought was a losing scenario. So again, at the end of the day, I do have to leave her here at number 7. Now, number 6, moving on to a player that also comes from season 1, a player that, again, I think is better than Marissa, despite the fact that she lost at the end, and that player is Ariana. And again, I think Ariana is actually a pretty underrated player in the grand scheme of Big Brother, to where she's a player that comes into the season not really knowing much about the show, but is able to really pick up the strategy of the game as the game goes along. Again, being in the initial majority, that takes out Chuck. Alongside that, again, builds a really strong bond with Brandy Glanville, and then also builds connections with Ross and Marissa, to where she ends up being the HOH. It takes out Shannon, to where, again, questionable if that's the correct move for her, though. To be fair, it's a better move for her than it's for Ross and Marissa. But again, she maintains a really good relationship with Amarosa that keeps her off the block during her HOH reigns. She is in potential danger during the final 7, though ends up winning veto that week. And throughout all of it, maintains a good relationship with Ross and Marissa, to where it keeps her safe at the final 5. And obviously gets taken out at the final 4 in a spot where, to be fair, she was always going to go home at 4 had she not win a comp there. So, and that definitely is a negative. But I think Ariana is a player that definitely demonstrated a lot of ability for the game. I think she definitely picked up on the game as it went along and recognized the fact that they had to go for Ross and Marissa, though obviously, again, was never really given the opportunity through the way the comps played out, to where she does also end up being a massive jury threat on the board. I think of the final 4, I think she beats literally everybody at the end of that grouping, while also doing, again, a lot of good jury management along the way. And again, I think Ariana actually comes off of this being a pretty solid player all around, where the main reason she's not higher is obviously because, again, her positioning towards the end game is not particularly great. I do think she demonstrates a lot of skills for the game, while also, again, at least being in the majority lines for the first half of the game. So again, that's enough to put her here at number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to a player that I remember I was very high on this player at the time of the season, where, while, again, I'm still obviously high on him, he's number 5 on this list, I do feel like the fact that this is Celebrity Big Brother in particular kind of harms him. And that player is Ricky Williams, who, again, obviously is the runner-up of Celebrity Big Brother 2 in a spot where he debatably plays the most impressive game on that season. Again, in terms of his navigation through the game, again, I think he does a lot well. I mean, he starts off the game, again, building a really strong bond with Lola and Natalie, to where they become a trio that ends up really dominating the majority of the game. Again, while obviously Natalie and Lola were the core, I do think he was the third in that group. So that really gives them the numbers to really just do anything that they really want to do. And we obviously see them, again, flip the vote onto Jonathan and take out Ryan and Joey. Again, he puts this target onto Tom Green's back and ends up getting him and Kato targeted by the time of the final 8. Now, at the final 7, he is on the block against Natalie initially, and again, potentially goes home if nominations stay the same, though Tom ends up using the veto on him. Not purposely, but again, has a veto used on him, and that's something, I guess. Only to then, again, take out Tom the following round and win the last 2 HOHs in a spot where I think he makes the correct call initially in taking out Candy. I think that's the right call there. However, I think he obviously makes a very questionable move at Final Four. Now, at the end of the day, he loses anyway. I think the issue of Ricky, again, in general, is the fact that, again, this is Celebrity Big Brother. This is a show where, one, again, these people are not taking the game particularly seriously, but also when they leave the show, they're able to see what's happening on the outside. And I think through the fact that, again, no one was particularly excited about a Ricky win, also he was not particularly good TV, I think leads to him, again, not having many jury prospects by the end. To where, while again, I do think he definitely mismanages his jury management of certain members of the jury, I do think he also navigated through the game in a very impressive way, only for it to amount to nothing because, again, this is Celebrity Big Brother. To where, because, again, it makes it a bit tough to rank him here, I decided to put him at 5, where, again, if this was a genuine ranking of how they would do on Big Brother US, the proper show, he would probably be higher. He would probably be top 3. At least higher than the next person we'll be talking about. But again, this is Celebrity Big Brother. And I think that's a major reason why, again, I don't think Ricky can win Celebrity Big Brother. To where, while he's pretty competent in most aspects of the game, again, socially he's definitely lacking. I do think his lack of win equity is enough to put him here number 5. Now, number 4, we are wrapping up Celebrity Big Brother 2 with the winner of the season. We do have Tamar Braxton. And again, Tamar, obviously not a winner of the show, and one that is very tough to assess, where straight up, I think Tamar's game is a losing one. If this was Big Brother US, if this was the proper show, I do think her treatment of the jury is abhorrent. To where, again, I think if it was not for the fact that they saw the show and saw her be a fun character and also saw the online community that was very pro Tamar, I do not think the jury turns around and votes for Tamar at the end. I think, again, Tom Green being a massive Tamar proponent would not happen if you did not see the online reaction to her. To where, again, I think Tamar is someone that is greatly benefited from the fact that this is Celebrity Big Brother. But again, this is a Celebrity Big Brother ranking. So through that, again, I think she is someone that is somewhat likely to win Celebrity Big Brother if she gets to the end. Again, I think people really recognize how entertaining of a presence she is. And through that, again, I think that really ups her overall win equity. Now, I think her navigation through the game, again, is essentially a worse version of Ricky's. Again, she is in that alliance, but again, is the 4th, while Ricky is the 3rd. I think she also, again, probably enables that group a bit too much, to where I think she gets very fortunate in the fact that, like, Tom wins his specific HOH to take out Natalie. And even then, she doesn't necessarily get her way up points, where, again, like, obviously Candy goes home against her wishes. Now, to be fair, again, she does end up essentially saving Candy at the Joey eviction, so, I mean, that's something. So, again, that at least shows her having agency in the game, but I do think she spends a lot of the game and being in the majority, but being at the very bottom of the majority, to where, dare I say, I do think she's essentially the Todd Bridges of this season, to where, again, I think she gets better comp results in the end game that definitely help her. Well, also, again, to be fair, I think she also manages Ricky pretty well, to where, while, again, she didn't even know she was managing Ricky pretty well, she was surprised by the fact that he took her to the end. I do think the fact that she, again, confirms the final 2 with him is good, better than Lola, I guess. He takes her to the end, and obviously he ends up losing to her, to where, again, I think there's good here in Tamar's game. Again, I think the fact she was at least in the majority, I think the fact that she got Ricky to take her to the end, and the fact that she was able to save Candy at points, again, I think that's good. The issue comes from, again, her treatment of the jury. I think her enabling the majority in a way that does not benefit her, or she kind of has to get lucky through certain comp results. Again, I think that is fundamentally bad enough to put Tamar here at number 4. Now, number 3, and I will say, the top 3 of this list are very, very difficult. I think this is probably one of the toughest top groupings of players I've had to rank for one of these rankings of every player of a certain show. What makes it so difficult is I think Celebrity Big Brother is a show where the runner-ups are typically players that played more impressive games than the winners. While the winners, again, obviously win the game, I think usually the winner's navigation through the game is a lot more sloppier than the runner-up, to where, and I think I personally would have voted for a runner-up in all 3 of the seasons of the show up to this point, to where, because that makes this ranking very difficult here, but I do consider these top 3 to be like the definitive top 3. I think these are by far the 3 best players of Celebrity Big Brother. But at number 3, I am going to go with a player that is definitely harmed by the fact that this is, again, a Celebrity Big Brother ranking. And this is a player that I just do not see winning Celebrity Big Brother in particular, and that player is Todrick Hall. And yet Todrick is a player that probably, from a pure navigation standpoint, probably plays the most impressive Celebrity Big Brother game. I think he is a player that dominates the game from beginning to end, gets to the end facing almost no adversity the entire time. While also, again, pulling off some decent maneuvers. Again, initially forms a majority with Misha, ends up being in the center of the house initially. Also ends up manipulating Carson to taking out Shannon, which is all very good play as well. Also maintaining numbers in the end game, though, again, Todrick plays an extremely impressive game on paper. The issue is jury management. Again, I think he manages the jury in a really abhorrent way. Again, the way he treats Chris on his way out is terrible. However, I will say, I do think his jury management is worse, particularly because this is Celebrity Big Brother. I think this is Big Brother US. Again, while, again, still bad jury management with Chris in particular, I think the rest of his poor jury management is not as bad. So again, I think part of what makes his jury management so bad here is the fact that, again, people are going to see what he said about them post-show and realize all the bad comments he made about people, which will obviously turn them against him. Also, again, he makes these comments that make him hated by the online community, which again turns people away. Again, essentially he is the antithesis to Tamar. Or again, I think Tamar is someone that is greatly benefited by the online community. I feel like Todrick is someone that is the complete opposite, where you have someone like Todd who leaves the game being somewhat pro Todrick, only for him to then completely flip after seeing the online community and say that he will never vote for Todrick. To where, again, I do think that is a major factor of Todrick's game on this season, though. Again, that's what he should have expected. This is Celebrity Big Brother. They knew the rules. And the fact that he is making all these comments to really just further burn the jury members after they leave, again, I think is very bad. So while I think his navigation through the game is, again, very impressive. Again, I think he plays easily the least flawed game in terms of how he gets to the end. But again, I think the fact that he mismanages the jury just so much is what makes it tough to put him higher on this list. Because again, this is a Celebrity Big Brother ranking. I think if this is a Big Brother US, I think there's definitely a chance he still gets to the end and still potentially wins. Where I think most of the jury members didn't really see a lot of the things that turned them against him until after they had left the house. But again, this is Celebrity Big Brother. So again, I think I have to take that into account, which is why he lands here at number 3. Now number 2. And I'll say these top 2 are very, very difficult. I think there's one player that I would have more faith in most given seasons, specifically to win, while the other person is someone that I would have more faith in navigation-wise, though, again, a little bit more rocky on if they would win. And initially, I actually came into this list having my number 2 person at number 1. However, when I think about it, I don't think I can pull the trigger on that. At number 2, I do have Ross Matthews. And again, Ross initially was number 1. And that is kind of despite of the game he plays on Celebrity Big Brother 1. I mean, while his game on Celebrity Big Brother 1 is, again, very impressive. Again, he is in the Dominant Alliance, very beginning. He really ends up running the show. Again, is alongside the majority in taking out Chuck. He then, again, has decision-making on if Shannon goes in week 2, pulls the bullet on Shannon on week 3. He then, again, builds very strong relationships with the people in the minority, to where while he has Amarosa going after him for the entire season, he builds a strong bond with James and Mark that essentially puts him in the center of the house. Especially if he's able to get rid of Amarosa, which he's not able to because Amarosa wins competitions. But even then, he's able to get some pretty fortunate outcomes for him. Again, he's able to get rid of Brandy in a spot where she was starting to potentially turn on him. You also have him being able to take out James, though to be fair, that's because he won the veto himself in a spot where he would have been in danger. But anyway, he takes out James at 6, which allows him to essentially run those endgame comps, which ends up essentially putting him in a very fortunate position by the endgame, to where, again, Amarosa is a very easy target at 5, where he then gets to a final 4 where pretty much everyone's going to take him to the end. Again, Ariana's a little bit up in the air. I think there's definitely a shot she takes Marissa, but again, Marissa takes him to the end, he takes himself to the end, and Mark takes him to the end. The issue is that he can't win the game. However, I think it's a fundamentally different situation than it is with Todrick, where Todrick, again, I think definitely deserves his loss. I think he does a lot of very poor jury management to cause his loss. Ross, not as much. I don't think Ross really does that much wrong. Now, again, yes, could he have placated Shannon's ego a bit better? Yes. Could he have not taken credit for things that James thinks that he did that pisses off James? Yes. However, I think this is essentially a position where Shannon was pissed at him. I think a lot of it coming from the fact that they were friends outside the show. And obviously Amarosa was just kind of against him the entire time. So I think they really spin the jury against him. In a spot where, again, most of the jurors did not seem to care about what the result was going to be. It simply just seemed to follow whatever Shannon and Amarosa said to do. I think someone like Chuck in particular is one of those people where, again, I think Chuck simply did not care at all about who won this season and was just taking advice from the others, to where, again, I think that is a factor here into Ross's loss. In a spot where, again, I think on most given seasons with the cast that actually cares a bit more, like had this been Celebrity Big Brother 2 or even 3, I think Ross probably wins those seasons. I think he just has a very unfortunate cast on season 1 that I just don't think would award him the win. But again, it's still a spot where he can't win the game. There's pretty much no situation where he wins the game on this season, which is the thing that makes it very difficult to assess. Because again, I think on paper, I would say Ross is kind of the perfect Celebrity Big Brother player. He is a player that is good in competitions, is very good socially, and is competent strategically. Now, again, I think him taking out Shannon when he did, bad. I think there are other questionable strategic decisions. And again, his overall navigation through the game is a bit sloppy, though again, that's due to some unlucky comp results. But still, I do think at the end of the day, Ross plays a very impressive game, seems like a very well-rounded player, but I think it is his lack of win equity in any situation on this season that makes it really tough to put him at number 1, where I very much considered it. And to be fair, I have very big flaws with the number 1 person as well. But I think at the end of the day, it's tough to justify putting him at number 1 when, again, he's not a winner of the show and he had no win equity on this season, where, again, I have to put him here at number 2. Now, number 1, the best Celebrity Big Brother player of all time, I guess, is Misha Tate, I guess, winner of season 3. And again, initially actually on my list, I had Misha at number 3. I was not intending on putting Misha at number 1. I think Misha, again, obviously plays an extremely dominant game, runs the game alongside Todrick for the entire season, gets to the end against Todrick and ends up winning. The issue is I think she doesn't win against literally anybody else. I think the jury was very anti-Todrick and Misha to where I don't think Misha can win the game against anybody but Todrick. Which again, in comparison to Ross, again, I guess that's just like a step better than Ross, because again, she can win one scenario, but really that's not the fundamental reason why I put her above Ross, where really, at the end of the day, her navigation through the game is more solid than Ross. I think it really was, again, Ross kind of having to win certain competitions and was facing more direct danger that puts him lower, while Misha is in a spot where I think she spends a lot more of the game safer, where even if she was on the block at certain points, I don't know if they could have gotten her out. So again, she forms the initial majority from the very beginning, and while that group of like Chris and Shannon turn against her, even then she's still a Todrick, Todd, and Lamar on her side. Had Todrick's complete loyalty, to where Todrick fully intended on going to the end of her the entire time. Also had Todd and Lamar's loyalty for a decent chunk of the game. And was also able to win Carson and Cynthia's loyalty at a point. Now again, I think Todrick is very responsible for that, and again, that is why I think Todrick has a bit of a debate here and potentially being number 1, because I do think Todrick's navigation through the game is a lot more impressive, and I think Todrick did a lot more of the legwork than Misha. However, Misha, again, is still no slouch. Again, I think Misha does some decent work in her own right. Well, again, being in a dominant alliance from beginning to end, to where while, again, you can definitely qualm some end game spots, again, she potentially goes home, but even then, I think Todrick would have really fought to try to keep her, to where, again, I think Todrick could have manipulated Cynthia into keeping her in the game anyway, to where, again, while she only has one specific winning scenario, that was a winning scenario she was always striving for and actually get to that scenario. However, the main reason I'm having her number 1 here, which is very opposed to what I would typically talk about, is the fact that she is such a comp beast on this season. She does win so many competitions on this season, to which, again, typically I would not really care that much about that. However, again, this is actually a spot where I think, considering this is Celebrity Big Brother in particular, I think that very much helps Misha, to where, and while I think there's obviously still a lot of randomness involved in these competitions, I do think if I was to have faith in one person in all Celebrity Big Brother to be able to comp their way to the end, it would be Misha. And I think Misha is in this spot where, and with this being a Celebrity Big Brother cast, which is typically an older grouping of people, and not all of them being very athletic, I think it leads to actually Misha having a lot more win equity in these competitions. It actually makes it seem a lot more probable that she would win, to where, again, anything that is physical, Misha is essentially an auto win, while she also has a pretty decent chance at winning any other competition as well. Where again, she's no slouch at any specific type of competition. Where again, I think Misha's actual comp ability is actually something that does greatly boon her on this list. Where while it typically wouldn't, I think the fact that again she is on Celebrity Big Brother in particular helps her there. Even though I think the fact that she's on Celebrity Big Brother in particular kind of helps her jury wise. Where again, that's the reason why I debated between her and Ross, is because I do think on paper I would say Ross wins more Celebrity Brother Final 2s than Misha. However, Misha also wins the one that she does get. And again, I think definitely can win other ones. Just, I think it's less likely, considering I don't think she's like really this like personality that really pops on screen and people really want to reward. Where again, I don't think there's that much of a difference between her and Ricky in terms of jury management. But again, at the end of the day, I do think she plays a very impressive game that again shows her being a complete dominator in competitions, having good social work at points, particularly within her own specific group of Todd, Todrick, and Lamar, while also again being okay strategically, even though I think Todrick had to do a lot more legwork there. But still, a somewhat well-rounded player that again for Celebrity Brother, which doesn't have the greatest grouping of players to begin with. For a while there was this big debate between these top 3 for me, at the end of the day, I did go with Misha here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every Celebrity Big Brother player. Again, so I promised back when I did the Big Brother ranking. So with that, I've essentially now ranked every player of US Big Brother outside of OTT, to where maybe I'll do OTT at some point. Straight up, ideally would like to do some sort of retrospective on OTT, to where I guess that would be where I coincide it with the player ranking. But to be honest, if I'm doing it alongside my retrospective series, obviously that would take a while to get to. But again, that is obviously an ideal situation at some point down the road. In general, obviously just expect more of the same content from the channel with other rankings like this and other just general Survivor Big Brother videos down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.